Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. I hope you enjoy. Speaker for the Depressed, written by Grenadier 42. Vasim Saskriti was nervous despite his best efforts. He had volunteered to be a speaker for the Depressed, for the newly discovered species on the fourth arm of the galaxy. If his argument was well received, the Assembly would vote on how many resources were necessary for the uplifting. If his argument was not well received, then it would either be tabled for later discussion, or conversely, a motion for containment would be discussed. It was entirely up to the speaker, and the speaker alone, therefore, to make sure that everything was properly addressed. Saskriti picked up a datapad and looked over his speech. He huffed in amusement, knowing the response to his words was going to cause confusion amongst the other races. The Vasim were not known to be a species of speech-givers who wove words to make others cry. They were a species who valued the ability to put complex ideas into small words. He felt his speech captured this beautifully, and it was the philosophy that had driven him to volunteer in the first place. Closing out his speech, he maneuvered through the mess of data in histories, wars, philosophies, and even the bathing habits before he found the piece that had inspired him. Laconic phrases. He attempted to mouth the unfamiliar word while listening to the translator's best attempt at rendering the proper pronunciation. The philosophy around them spoke to him from across the stars and ages, and he had known in that moment he had to speak for them. Pausing, he glanced at the clock. He was expected in the chambers in 200 heartbeats. He breathed for a moment, holding the breath while feeling the joy of being, before breathing out and standing. The moment had passed, and the next approached. Gathering his datapad, he strode confidently out of his office, startling the Zithrathi that had come to collect him into a chittering mass. He ignored the poor insects, striding confidently down the glistening halls adorned with the portraits of each previous successful speaker. If he succeeded, his would adorn the halls after this, as his words would have uplifted an entire species. If he failed, he would return home in disgrace. He smiled briefly as he thought about the Olympics, where men wished to either win or die to avoid the humiliation. A fascinating species. The hallway he walked down did not curve or veer in any direction, as it was set up solely for the benefit of the speaker. The room he had occupied was just for him as well, to prepare his speech. Once he had finished, he would return to the vacancy until another depressed was disclosed. The hallway would remain lit so that diplomats would come and admire the works of what the Republic considered the greats, but generally it sat well lit but empty. Reaching the end of the hallway, he finally turned and began ascending a small set of stairs that took him to the center of the assembly. He began climbing up the spiraling stairs, giving him ample opportunity to not only observe, but be observed by every sentient species in the galaxy. Every member needed an opportunity to remember the faces of the ones speaking. Finally, reaching the top, he turned and looked to the full grandeur of the assembly house. At the time of its construction, there had been 48 members, and each had been involved in the design. The house was round, with a central podium to show that no one, not even the current speaker, was more or less important. No one sat out front, as there was no front, nor was there a back. It merely was and is. Each member had constructed a single segment of the house in their own world style, making the entire building a kaleidoscope mess of different clashing colors and design choices. The final builders had managed to put together into something that didn't completely assault the eyes, but first impressions were always that it was ugly. However, second and third impressions always showed that the beauty of the joint effort began to show through, until each species grew rather fond of the horrid building. Saskriti breathed again, taking in another moment. He held the breath as he placed the datapad on the podium in front of him, before releasing the breath and awaiting the next. He nodded to the announcer and snicked named Liss, who began the formal introductions. 10 full cycles ago, the depressed species was discovered in the fourth arm of the galaxy. Per protocol, a full collection of all their histories, writings, works of art, and mannerisms was compiled and given to each of the 99 members of the assembly, Liz said. This council meeting is to discuss whether or not to uplift the species that calls itself humanity. Liz then looked over to Suscritti, who could see the nervousness on the other species' face. 1 cycle ago we began accepting applications to be the speaker for the depressed. In a rather, she paused, seemingly struggling to find the true word, surprising situation, the first applicant was a Vasim, not the Kalrai or the Plercha. A low murmur broke out across the assembly at that point, as everyone had now received confirmation of their suspicions. The speaker was not announced until this moment in order to prevent bias forming, and the Snikt had spoken true. A Vasim had never even requested to be a speaker. In fact, 10 of the last 20 speakers had been Karlai, 18 if the Plercha were included. Some believe that this rarity was the single reason that they had been chosen. In accordance with the rules, Vasim Suscritti will have 1 full station rotation to make their arguments, at which point questions can be posed by the attending members without limit, Bliss said, having recovered from her own surprise. Now I hereby present Vasim Suscritti, Vilas and Sid. Polite applause, grunting, and other signs of approval rippled through the attending members, but Suscritti could hear the nervous tension. He hummed internally, taking in the moment, before politely brushing his fur and stepping up to the podium. He breathed, held, and then made the first part of his speech. They buried their dead. He stepped back down and sat in a chair that was made of available for speakers in case of a long debate or, in rare cases, outbursts. Liz looked at him, the horror on her face evident and mirrored by the quiet drone starting to grow in the assembly house. Instead of listening to it, he leaned his head back and looked at the vote, a giant conical mechanism that was suspended over the central tower. Displayed across its surface was the vote, the tally of agreements and disagreements that each species would make in relation to a topic. Right now, no votes were being shown, but he was confident that that was going to change. Almost on cue, a light flicked on, showing that Vasim had just voted to uplift. Suscritti hummed in satisfaction. Even if he failed here today, at least he had been granted the blessing of his people. The laconic phrase had spoken to his delegation in the same way it had to him. And so, even if he failed, he could return home safe in the knowledge that he would not be exiled. The noise of confusion and alarm began to steadily increase, growing from a low murmur to a cacophony of shouting, swearing, chittering, banging, and expletives that were impolite for the gravity of the situation. Suscritti let it continue. He was in no hurry to correct anyone, as he felt the phrase spoke for itself. This was all part of his speech. He had wanted to debate the rage so that when he finally explained it, the simplicity of the argument would speak for itself. After nearly 2/3 of a rotation had passed, Suscritti finally stood and retook the podium, much to the relief of Liz and to the rest of the assembly. The Vasim were definitely known for being concise, but even this had been almost insulting to the entire process. However, he was back with an explanation, and as he waited patiently, standing still and keeping his fur flattened in a sign of bored resignation, the noise in the house slowly decreased until it died altogether. "Do you not understand?" Suscritti asked condescendingly as he swept the assembly with his gaze. "They bury their dead." He looked around again, taking moments to look at each of the 99 members, and seeing quiet discussions among several of them. "What purpose does land serve if you put an ancestor into it?" he asked, looking back at his datapad. "None. You cannot farm your ancestors, you cannot harvest their spiritual energy, nor can you gain some sort of tactile benefit from placing them into productive soil. In fact, placing remains into the soil can poison it. So what benefit does it provide to these humans to bury their dead?" At this point, he pulled out a small hollow device and activated it, causing a series of diagrams to appear above his head. He pointed up at the diagrams. "I compiled the death rituals of every species assembled here today, and if you look at one on the surface, it appears incredibly varied. Cremation, weapon forging, ritualistic consumption, fruit planting, etc." He looked back at the assembly. But what was the point of all of this? He waited, watching the realization slowly slink in across a few species, and confusion settled in to even more. He sighed, a sound not unlike a growl, before closing his eyes and placing his hands on the podium. He breathed in the moment, the quiet murmur of slow realization, before breathing back out. They believe in something greater than themselves, just like these humans do. They believe that there is something more, something outside their own understanding and capabilities, and they want in, he said, his eyes still closed while he breathed. Every species here has funeral traditions because we too once believed in something greater than ourselves, and we wished to tap into that, to be a part of it, and to hope that existence was not meaningless. Opening his eyes, he looked back out across the assembly, casting his gaze across the architecture of the 48 founders that adorned the walls and ceiling. Is that not what this place is about? Is it not a place dedicated to the ideal? Then there is something greater than we should all be striving towards. Is this not a monument to the idea that it takes more than art or science or war or philosophy to be considered one of us? He reached over and turned off the hollow device, and deactivated the datapad as well. He collected them into his hands before glancing over at the clock, showing that the station had almost finished its rotation. He hummed and breathed in the moment of silence that now hung across the assembly as each species considered his words. Breathing out, he added finally, Is it our place to deny them? After all, there is something more. He picked up his datapad and hollow device, turned around, and sat back down in the chair that had been provided. He placed them on his lap and continued to breathe, taking in the moment as the assembly descended into chaos once again. 4 rotations later, after a long series of questions and answers, the assembly overwhelmingly agreed to uplift the new race of humanity and accept them into their fold. It was agreed that the Vasim would be the vanguards in the uplifting effort, and that the phrase, "there is something more," would become an official motto for the project. Humanity had been found worthy. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, Lord Azrakal, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon WRE, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.